like I would have little revelations throughout different trips, like oh, I tend to, blab about something because I'm trying to please somebody and I should shut the fuck up, that kind of, there's little things that I just, because it happens during a trip, it can be very impactful. I'm like, I remember the moment.
Welcome to the Wild Dispatch.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of The Wild Dispatch. I'm Robin, and as usual, I'm back with more skills and stories from the wild. Today, we are continuing our way down the mycological kaleidoscope with Eugenia Bone. Now, Eugenia is a food and nature writer whose work has appeared in many anthologies, magazines, and newspapers across the entire planet. So, understandably, I'm pretty excited to get her on the show today. She's a member of the faculty at the New York Botanical Garden, where she teaches classes on edible and psychedelic mushrooms. She's the author and co-author of 9 different books on food and biology, including Mycophilia, which is probably the most famous, maybe I'd say, and Have a Good Trip, which is her latest book, in which she rolls up her sleeves and goes deep into the world of magic mushrooms and how to experience them. So we're going to cover a lot about that today. Continuing from last week's episode, which was all about the psychedelic experience, we are continuing the same theme today, so giving a lot of emphasis to that book and everything that Eugenia learned through her own personal experiences and the research that she did in the process of making the book. If you're new to the podcast and you like what you hear, then please do all the things that people who like podcasts do. If you could give us a follow, leave a review. If you even have the time, it's nice to share with a friend who you think will enjoy the show. Once again, a big thank you to Eugenia for sharing her time with us today. Here she is now.
In
I guess
a way.
so. Yeah, I
I
guess
think
it
so.
is.
Losing it in the toilet is also metaphoric. Kind of a different metaphor altogether.
I don't know if you've heard some of those stories of people who are in. We are like already going down a mad rabbit hole, but people who are at like national parks, you know, the kind of restroom setup you have there, like concrete building with a kind of hole in the floor situation. People who drop their phones down there go they go through like a bit of a moment where like I'm just gonna have to try and get it because it's like I don't know, it's a
Yeah,
lot of money. It's like $1,000 phone or something,
yeah,
and so they go down there and then
yeah.
they get stuck, and it's like it's a whole
Oh, they
thing.
get down in there.
People get down in there and then they realize they can't climb
Oh,
out, and it's like,
oh,
can you imagine?
nasty, nasty. Yeah,
Yeah, I think
yeah.
I heard
Well, I
someone.
imagine. Go
Go
on.
on.
Well, I was just gonna say, I imagine Parks Department folks are like, "Oh God, there's another person who
Yeah,
is stuck in the John because they are trying to retrieve their phone."
I mean, I can't imagine a much worse situation than that. Oh, I don't know.
Yeah.
Terrible. Okay, check my list. One little trick. Yeah, okay, I'm curious. Do people get you to do this in previous interviews that you've done? Do a little like pause for like 20, 30 seconds to get some back sound so that you've got stuff if you want to like edit things around. Do people do that?
Yeah.
Because I do that and I
In
wonder if no one else
yeah.
does.
Well, in film, yeah.
Okay,
They
good.
always get room tone, the quiet room.
Yeah, right. That gives you a
Uh,
bit of flex.
yeah, they
Otherwise,
call it room tone. Yeah. Yeah, always with film. Like when I worked with Louis, for example, there was lots of quiet time before we could start anything.
yes, I just
Mm.
watched that last night. Actually, I thought I should watch it again. It's good.
Mm.
It's great. It's a really like, yeah, it's a nicely put together film. Like a lot of interesting things in there, which I don't think I know everything, but you think you have a general idea about how everything goes, and you watch something like that again, and you're like, oh, okay, now there is some stuff in there which I just completely forgot about.
Right. It's never ending, actually, like any study.
Yeah, even now, because that was what 5 years ago. So it's probably all changed by
Absolutely.
then.
It keeps accumulating. Everything seems to be getting, thicker and richer and fatter.
Exactly.
Uh,
Okay, Eugenia Bone, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, you've written many books, articles, spoken on documentaries, and as we just chatted about, you were on a rather large documentary about fantastic fungi. I believe that's the title.
Yeah.
Um, Also, I should note, an early podcast adopter. I was doing a little bit of research about you, listening to a few previous conversations, and something go back to like 2012 even. So that's yeah, jumping into the
Yeah.
on the podcast wagon early.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's also the mushroom community, they are have always been far-seeking and quirky. So for people who would say, I'm going to do a show on mushrooms, I mean, it would be a mushroom person that would think that way. Why not? We'll find somebody. And so they connect. There was a smaller community in 2012 for sure.
So it's the perfect place then, I guess. It's where everyone can share ideas. It makes sense. We have also got a note here. You've won quite a few awards for your writing with your books as well.
Thank you. More nominations than actual awards, but nominations are pretty good too.
Yeah, I mean, you're you're
Yeah.
you're there, right? You're being mentioned, so
Yeah.
that's the good thing.
You're kind of on the team. Yeah. Yeah. It's fun. It's always exciting when things like that happen.
So what I was curious about, I mean, there's lots of things that I want to ask you about. I have far too many pages of notes and questions here, so forgive me if I'm ruffling pages as we talk. But I was hoping that we could just go back a little bit and hear about your journey before we jump into the books that you've written and your newest book as well, Have a Good Trip, which is all about the experience of psilocybin and how to, I guess, go through that in a positive way or maximize your chances of having a positive experience. Before we do that, I'd love to go back and hear your story. I'd love to hear how you became the person you are. So
Ah.
it's a big, I guess, start with the big questions.
How intimate do you want to be? Yeah, I'm delighted to. I mean, in terms of mushrooms, but it's really like a writer's journey as
Yeah,
much as anything else
yeah.
because, in my view, for writers, your curiosity is kind of your destiny. If you have the luxury to be able to write about the things that interest you. So for me, I started out as a food writer, writing cookbooks. I wrote for all the magazines. My beat was primarily food preservation, which is uh, like kitchen microbiology, basically. And so it's how to kill molds and other microbes. And my other beats were foraging and wild foods. So I wrote about hunting and fishing and looking for mushrooms. And then over time, and so this was like the 80s and 90s. And over time, I became more and more interested in foraging for or gathering critters that hide versus critters that flee.
Okay.
So I haven't really done that much duck hunting or anything. Once I sort of fell down the mushroom wormhole. And so for me, what that entailed was, I was writing about wild mushrooms, cooking them, but in order to, there was very little diversity of species available in markets when I first got interested.
Okay.
So I had to find these mushrooms, and in order to find mushrooms, wild mushrooms, you need to know a little bit about why they live where they live. And so I started to attend, I joined the New York Mycological Society, and I started to attend lectures and go to forays and festivals, and learn enough mycology to be a better mushroom hunter. So it was still like acquisitionally oriented interests. But then over time, I became so fascinated with mycology. I mean, it really was like a doorway into becoming more involved with nature in general, that I didn't spend that much time with food anymore, and I was moving more into writing about nature.
Okay.
And so that's the sort of track I took, and I've continued on and writing about. So I've written about microbiology, and that comes out of my interest in food preservation. I've written about mycology and mushroom hunting, comes out of my interest in eating wild foods. now this new book is about psilocybin mushrooms, psychedelic mushrooms, which is really just another kind of type of consumption. It's just
Yeah.
it just satisfies in different ways. And so in the past, where mushrooms were like the window by which I came to understand nature in a deeper way, now magic mushrooms are like the window by which I've come to understand myself in a deeper way. So it's, an ongoing
Yeah, it all
process
kind
of
of,
self-discovery.
yeah, that's so interesting. So you said that I mean, like you kind of very eloquently went through that whole journey that
Yeah.
you've done. But
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Under 200 words,
the thing
ideally.
I was curious about as well, I guess you said that it started with food, and I've got a little note
Mhm.
here about, I'm wondering, I mean, your father, and I'm probably going to massacre his name, Edward Jobby, is that right?
Ah, no, you didn't massacre it. Good on you. Yeah.
So I'm
My,
wondering, did you grow up a lot around food,
yeah.
the value of ingredients? Do you have any memories from that time, like learning in that environment?
Oh, yes. I mean, and my interest in food grew out of my appetites, and my appetites were whetted because I, had this fantastic food experience as a child. Over the course of my career, lots of young food writers have approached me and said, so what should I do to prepare for a career in writing about food? And I would say, eat, 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 eat.
Yeah,
That's it. You really have to develop your palate. And I had the benefit of being exposed to very flavorful foods with a specific with specific ethnic parameters throughout my childhood, and then that expanded into other countries, the foods of France, for example, or Greece. So my dad, Edward Giobi, when you said that right, he that's my maiden name, right? My
okay.
my maiden name is Eugenia Jobbi. It's like perfect if you're an opera star, kind of sucks for everything else. So when my husband said, "Do you want to get married?" And I said, "Well, I'll take Bone for sure." I'm like, not sentimental reasons, but purely literary ones. Anyway, my dad, Edward Giobi, wrote cookbooks about Italian food. He was involved in this crowd of chefs that were all like working class people, but were very important in the development of cuisine in the United States, like Pierre Frenet and Jacques Pepin. So those folks would all get together, and we kids, were tagged along because we were kids. And so I observed them, and sometimes, at least when the potlucks and stuff they would do were at our home, I was the eldest child, so I would get the job of, washing or chopping or going and finding some parsley in the garden for them and so on. And it really, expanded my sense of the action of the kitchen. And so that's something else I love.
Yeah.
So between palate and exposure to chefs and what a kitchen and what an active kitchen feels like, and also the fact that I like to eat so much. I mean, that's what got me started with preserving. My dad used to can tuna fish, and we had a kind of nanny from my mother's from the South, and she came from Arkansas. Um, and her name was Lucille, and she would make crabapple jelly when the crab apples came in on a tree on the property. We had a hobby farm growing up, and so I wanted to reproduce those tastes. So that's how what motivated me to become a preserver. So that's it. It all comes for me, from my childhood and what I was exposed to, which is primarily a Central Italian cuisine.
That makes a lot of sense, actually. I was wondering because in doing a bit of research about you, I know that you moved later on to Colorado, and we can talk about that in a bit. But I maybe assumed that a lot of your experiences with canning and interactions with nature maybe came at a later date, just by my own presumptions about being in New York.
No, but it's true. It's totally true. You're not being presumptuous because I grew up on a little hobby farm. My father had chickens and rabbits and a big garden and all that stuff. But I moved to New York when I was 18, 19, and I was not in, I was like going to the clubs. I was
Yeah,
wearing
yeah,
plastic mini skirts and going to clubs. So that was a whole different lifestyle. But once I had kids, I was more, staying at home more, and I was using the farmers markets a lot, and cooking from the out of the farmers markets. So I was kind of halfway, fully entrenched in a local food scene, and at that time, really, the whole farm to table thing was beginning to happen. And then my husband, Kevin, is originally from Colorado, and around midlife time, he was like, I really want to get back in the mountains. So he bought this cabin on the western slope of the Rockies in western Colorado. It's sort of the working West, and it's surrounded by mountains with that. They've got forest roads, but there's really nobody up there except bear and elk,
Stunning.
um, and it's full of mushrooms when they come up. And so I started to learn about collecting porcini, for example,
Yeah.
because I'm an Italian and I can identify a porcini just based on my DNA. And then from there, the other edibles that were available. So that's what really turned me on, was the access to the habitat, which I didn't have in New York, and was limited in the part in Westchester County in upstate New York where I grew up, because, it's all private residence. So there's
Yeah.
not a lot of habitat that anybody can go, and, you can't tromp around on somebody else's property. I mean, you can. A lot of people do, but you shouldn't.
Yeah, you shouldn't,
Not
but
without
it doesn't
asking.
mean that people don't.
Oh, yeah.
Well, that does make a lot of sense. Can I pick your brains about canning then? Because I'm so fascinated
Yeah.
about it. Like
Oh, it's fun.
we've done a little bit about it, but
Yeah.
I mean, so bit of context. My wife and I moved to a small little, again, like hobbyist kind of farm. It's just like a 3 acre
Hmm.
place that we look after. We're
It's
very lucky. It
enough.
was
Yeah.
right about the beginning of COVID, so it was like absolute perfect timing. Um,
Yeah.
but through that exposure, like you kind of said, being surrounded by nature and being like that, it's so accessible. I mean, just now I'm have like chanterelles and candy caps growing on my actual lawn. It's like it's
Awesome.
fantastic, right? So I
Yeah.
think through that exposure to the nature that I coming from LA, again, it's the same thing. I mean, it's a very different environment anyway, but having animals walking through your yard all the time, just that exposure completely changes your outlook, doesn't it? And kind of
Hmm.
sparks that curiosity. But anyway, that was a bit of a ramble, but canning is something which we have done a little because obviously we've got fruit trees and we've got other things here. I guess like maybe you could talk a little bit about the principles of canning. Like there's a few different approaches. I remember hearing you talk about this in another podcast and I thought it was pretty interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. I wrote a book about it called Well Preserved, which is really about small batch canning. That's the one that was nominated for a James Beard. But I always write about canning in my cookbooks. I've written quite a few.
Yes.
And I think it's fantastic because, not only can you preserve, stuff that's coming in that's seasonal, and you keep your sort of carbon footprint small and their flavor footprint high or large, but also it can be a method of sort of semi-preparation for other meals, depending on what you're canning. So the kind of preserving, I mean, I don't spend much time with fermentation. I do some, or extractions. I do some, but primarily I water bath can, which is a canning technique where you process jars in boiling water, which is at sea level 212 degrees for a given amount of time, and that, depending on the acidity of the product in the jar, if it's high enough, or if it's high enough acidity or low enough pH,
Hmm.
it will render any spoilers that are present inert. And so the jar is safe to store on a shelf. For foods that, like mushrooms, that are more alkaline, you either have to acidify them to water bath can them, or you have to pressure can them, which is allows you to bring the food to a higher temperature and kill whatever spoilers are present through temperature. And also, it's a prescribed amount of time you process. So, for example, you actually have to process mushrooms for quite a long time.
Oh,
Although
interesting.
the pressure, if you're going to do pressure canning, like non-acidified mushrooms, The pressure stays the same. It's based on your altitude. So at sea level, it's 10 pounds per square inch. There's a little gauge, and you have to, measure it on your gauge. Make sure you stay within within the proper PSI. Um, but mushrooms can take, yeah, it's like 40 minutes. It's a really long time. Tuna fish takes like 70 minutes, a really long time. But that's I use USDA data for my preserving for my preserving times and temperatures.
Okay.
Uh, you people on the internet do all kinds of things, and I'm like, God go with you. You know, I like the USADA. I like the USDA data because I know I can count on it.
Yeah.
It's not very creative, so I had to, in my various books, I have had to make some adjustments in order to preserve foods that are, don't really come up with the food preservationist folks
Okay.
at the
They're
USDA.
not in the
They don't
manual.
have the same palate. Yeah.
Okay.
They're much more Midwestern in their kind of palate. And
Okay.
so there's lots of stuff for green beans, but not so much for, artichoke hearts and vinegar. I mean, in olive oil.
Yes.
So,
Yeah. I'm
yeah.
curious, does keeping mushrooms at like a relatively high temperature for a long period of time, how does that impact the texture of them? I'm sure that must have some kind of effect.
Actually, I'm so glad you mentioned that because one of my favorite things to talk about is the sort of the biology of mushrooms. Mushrooms have one of the things that mushrooms have in common with animals is they have a type of sugar in their cell walls called chitin. And chitin is very tough stuff. It's what allows a mushroom to push through asphalt. Have you ever seen that on
Yeah, it's
the side of the
crazy.
road?
Yeah.
How can something that is 80 or 90% water push through asphalt and not fall apart? Well, it's the chitin. Chitin's also the indigestible part that when you eat a mushroom, the chitin goes down into your lower GI, and it feeds microbes and does who do good chores for you and keep
Yeah.
you healthy.
Yeah.
But the chitin is also, just from a cook's perspective, chitin um, is, because it's so durable under any circumstances, heat, digestion, acids in your tummy. Um, it it ensures that the texture or the integrity of the mushroom is retained,
Hmm.
even if it gets a pummeling from heat,
That's so
right?
curious.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. So chitin, so when you're cooking mushrooms, to keep that in mind, you can cook them like there was this, I did this book, the Fantastic Fungi Community Cookbook,
Hmm.
and in it there's this really simple, really delicious recipe for a miso enoki soup. Enoki is sort of like those little white nails you buy at the supermarket. So they look really fragile, right? I made the soup. It's delicious. I highly recommend the recipe. And then I had some leftover soup, and I also had some clams on hand because I still collect clams. And and so I thought, all right, I'm going to put the clams in and kind of expand the soup, and I'll just accept the fact that these gnocchi are going to be like spaghetti,
Yeah. Right.
afterwards.
Yeah.
They're going to be all mushy and terrible. I don't care. I'm going to eat it anyway. That is not at all what happened. A second cooking, and those gnocchi were as integritous, they were as firm as they always were. In fact, in some cases, a little more firm. So it was a lesson that the chitin is your friend if you choose to cook mushrooms more than once. So that's why, like, I just got a whole bunch of hedgehogs because I was in San Francisco, I was in Marin,
Nice.
and I bought them from Connie Green Wine Forest. I hope your listeners know about her.
No.
Wine Forest Wild Foods. Connie Green is legendary. Anyway, so I
Okay.
bought all these hedgehogs, and I couldn't eat them right away, so I boiled them. I'll
Interesting.
cook them later. They're fine. They will retain their integrity, even by the time I cook them a second time in a soup or whatever. I just boiled them to kill off any critters and stop the enzymatic action of degradation.
Interesting.
And so it's the chitin. So it's a really wonderful thing to know that a little mycology can actually make you a better mushroom cook.
It's curious as well. I mean, this is an unrelated thing. It's related in some way, but hedgehogs, more than many of the other mushrooms, I guess you're talking about the belly button variety, are you, or the sweet tooth, the larger?
Sweet tooth is what I bought. Yeah,
Okay, so
from
the
Connie.
bigger ones.
Hmm.
Okay, we don't find, well, I say I don't find so many of those around here, but we have most of the belly button ones, and the thing they shrink like such an unbelievable amount. You have to
Yeah,
really just like they touch the pan for just a little bit, and just all this water dumps
all
out
the
of them,
water comes out.
and you
Yeah,
think whatever portion you thought you had is now
yeah.
maybe a fifth of the size.
Well, that's what happens when you dry them too for preservation. So, they're like mushrooms are many, well, not many, some species are better than others for drying, but when you dry them, they reduce like by almost 10 times. So they become so much smaller. And they have to be dried till they're cracker crisp, right? They have to be really
Yes.
well dried. Otherwise, there can be because they're low acidity because they're an alkaline food. They can easily they're a good habitat for a variety of microbes.
And you mean they as in all mushrooms, or do you mean specifically hedgehogs?
No, pretty much all mushrooms. I don't think I've never encountered a significant difference in pH among mushrooms.
Okay, that's interesting.
Uh,
It's a good thing to know as well because I've been confession time. I've been
mm,
drying mushrooms, porcini. There's a lot of porcini right near me that
oh,
I mean, it's the last few weeks, but
lucky you.
yeah, I mean, spoiled rotten, and also candy caps as well. And
Mm.
been drying those out, but I haven't. Being relatively new to mushroom hunting, I haven't yet got a professional dehydrator. I've just been
Ah,
what's it called? Yeah, a dehydrator. That's the one. So I've
yep.
been used
Mhm.
kind of getting by. At least I think I'm getting by, but we'll see. Using kind
Get a
of
dehydrator. Yeah.
exactly, yeah, using
It's
just like a
yeah.
dehumidifier and putting it on the outlet and everything, and it's drying it out, but it's probably not drying it out quite enough.
Cracker crisp is the goal with mushrooms.
That's
They
the
have to like
technical.
snap like a that is, the easiest thing to communicate. That equals about 90% dehydrated,
Okay,
which is what you need. That level of dehydration is what you need to make sure spoilers can't proliferate.
yeah, it's pretty hard to achieve that without the professional gear, I guess.
You know what? It's not even professional, those dehydrators are
Not too
they're
expensive.
kind of not expensive
Yeah,
and yeah,
I should
you
stop
just
making
plug them in.
excuses.
I mean, if you're collecting porcini and candy caps, both of which are wonderful dried,
Yeah,
they just have tons of flavor and lots of things you can do with them that dried that you don't necessarily do with them fresh. Then, invest what I think $28 into a dehydrator.
oh, $28? I thought it was
Kinda.
more than that. Wow. Okay.
Maybe you can buy one that's like 10
Yeah.
trays, or
Yeah.
whatever,
Exactly.
or you can get one of steel, but I got a little plastic number and it's,
It's yeah,
yeah,
gets the job done.
gets the job done.
Okay. Well, thank you for indulging me on the
Not at all. I
on
love
that rabbit
talking
hole.
about that. Yeah.
Something else I'm curious about. I guess this is like a double part question, and it'll be like you can respond with whichever you think is relevant first. Obviously, want to talk about psychedelics, and that's kind of what we're going to go into for a huge part of this conversation. But you have a very technical understanding of what's going on with mushrooms, with mushrooms, and I remember hearing you talk about the process of going back to education and kind of re-upping your understanding of what's actually happening on a scientific level. Was that something that happened before you decided to get into psychedelics and start writing about that, or was it something that happened, I guess, during the process of just wanting to learn more about mushrooms in general?
Yeah. So in terms of learning basic mycology, I found that I was able with my own just general background, I was able to read papers. I had a lot of people, scientists who were really open to talking with me, and I developed relationships with them over time. But then when I wanted to write about bacteria, I found that for my book Microbia, I found I was in big trouble
Okay.
because I just didn't have, like, I was reading these papers about bacteria and I was like, what the fuck is this? I mean, I just didn't know what I was reading. I did not have the background. I just didn't have the basic cell biology. So I decided, if I want to I just wanted to know. It was like the price of my curiosity.
Yeah.
A lot of times, I think anyone might feel like, you know, to pursue your curiosity shouldn't be expensive. I don't mean necessarily money wise, but energy wise.
Yes.
But it sometimes is. And I was very curious about the role of bacteria in life, in my body, in the soil, in the atmosphere. I knew these invisible organisms were everywhere and in everything. And I wanted to understand as much as I could about it. So I went back to college and studied basic cell biology for a year. I mean, it was really elemental. It's like I was with a bunch of kids, which was its own kind of like lesson in humility. But I got to the point where I could read those papers. I couldn't read the really technical stuff, but for my purposes, I didn't need to go there. I was able to read an abstract, and I was able to determine if it was going to be of import to my education and to my, writing efforts. So that's what I did. I went back to school and did it, and it was quite a adventure.
And do you think that then impacted the choices you made after about what you could feel comfortable jumping into and rolling up your sleeves? So I guess your latest book, which is far more about the specifics about psychedelics, do you think that that informed then, that really helped the way that you approached that book, or do you think it was just kind of a separate thing?
You know how it informed as a writer is that I really I really learned a lesson that writers, they probably tell you in J school or something, but I really profoundly learned the lesson that you can't write about what you don't know. You have to be 100% sure, and it's very hard if the subject is wide and
Mm.
complicated, like nature.
Yeah.
So I realized I had to qualify a lot of the things that I was sharing when in the analogy would in terms of have a good trip, the book about psilocybin mushrooms is writing about the hypothetical um, neurology or neuroscience behind what happens when you take these mushrooms. It's like, first of all, I had to get some my neuroscience kind of ABCs down, which took a lot of effort and a lot of conversations to try to figure out. And I still am like, ugh. And it turns out that it's mostly hypothetical because it's not like you can go into the brain when somebody's tripping and see, what's going on. Um, so I had to learn to live on the edge of the unknown as a writer. It's a very difficult place to be when at the same time, it's important to write about what you know. So that's the lesson that I, walked away from. Is how to balance those two factors. Living on the edge of the unknown, which is very much the case when it comes to the neuroscience surrounding psychedelics, and writing about what you know, which is
So
necessary
tricky.
so you don't sound like an asshole when you write a book. That's
It's
it. That's it. It's like if you can't live with those, with those kind of conflicting philosophies, um, then you should maybe be writing something else. Maybe I should go back to recipes, you know?
so
And in fact, I write recipe books and science books back and forth, I alternate. It's
okay.
like I need a little
You
mental
need a break.
rest. Yeah.
Do you find also, I guess you might require as you're writing, I did manage to read some of your latest book. There's a few moments at the beginning making some caveats at the beginning about certain interpretations or things like that. Do you find that in general then when you're riding that line between I guess, like understanding entirely the subject matter, which is also still being figured out at a rapid rate. And then, yeah, do you find that you are needing to? I mean, I guess that would help, wouldn't it? You just need to like set things out and be honest and be like, this is the
Exactly.
world that we're living in right now.
Exactly. You cannot, and I think when I was in a more naive writer, I would try to sound like I always knew what I was talking about. But you cannot bullshit the reader. And I cannot bullshit the reader. I have to say, this is what's known that I can report. This is what's unknown that I can report, and
Yeah.
this is what's unknowable so far.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
this is what looks like it's unknowable. And it's a kind of transparency that's really hard on the ego, I think. But I don't know, at my age, the thing about growing old is I find in my case, it's like a chipping away of the ego. It
Yes.
has its good sides and it has its bad sides, but the good side is that liberty to be completely honest about what and transparent about what you know and what you can't know and what you do know
It's so
and what
true.
you don't know.
It's so true to all things in life, isn't it? It's very freeing to just, for whatever reason, sometimes there might be that feeling that you're going to go down a hole to try and, piece together whatever information you do know and make something up.
Uh-huh.
But to just
Well,
say, look, I don't
it
really know.
yeah, I mean, you got to do your homework,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, I, I take a dim view of the fake it till you make it, sort of philosophy because I think, just do your work and then say what you know,
Yeah.
what you've learned. But I think that also, in the case of this book, Have a Good Trip, where I'm trying to share information. It's like a resource for people who are psychedelic curious or psychedelic reckless. Um, yeah, so I felt I have an obligation to be very transparent and clear because that's the goal of the book is to provide information that people can trust. And unfortunately, so much of the psychedelic world is populated by um, you know sales and advocacy, and not that it's bad intentioned. I'm not attributing any kind of moralistic stance to it, um, but how do you determine how how psychedelics might fit into your life if the material you read call it a medicine?
Yeah.
Right there, it's advocacy. As a writer, I can't do that. Not not as the writer I am, So I would never cross that line to say, well, it's a medicine, so it's going to heal you or you or you. There
I
we
was
go.
going to ask you about that specific language as I've noticed that in the way that you use. So
Yeah.
medicine, you don't, there's no time when the word medicine is appropriate.
Well, it's if somebody's quote,
Okay.
or if it's yeah, only in someone else's context. But the words in terms of nomenclature, I think that's a real, like when I do my talks, I explain that's a real tell of whether there's advocacy involved. This is from my perspective. I mean, if you're already aboard the notion that psilocybin is a medicine, that's where you're at. But as a writer, as a journalist, I have to provide information that is not prejudiced by my own idea of how things should be used or shouldn't be used. So
Yes.
right, I can't do that.
Yeah.
You can't trust
You
me
can't have an
if
agenda.
I'm calling it a medicine. That's the way I look at it. So I know it upsets people in the psychedelic industry to use the word, or the psychedelic scene to use the word drug, and it's because it's associated with, dirtier drugs. Um, but also that's a kind of psychedelic exceptionalism that a guy named Dr. Carl Hart at Columbia says is the way rich white intellectuals separate their drug use from other people's drug use. So I don't want to have anything to do with that stuff.
Yeah.
I just want to provide information that you can trust as being as accurate as I portray it to be. So, and with caveats sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, medicine, I don't say. Entheogen, I don't say. Shroom, I don't say, which implies use to me too, like I'm going to the club. I don't do any of that. I call it a drug, which is what psilocybin is, no matter how or why you use it. and it's the most neutral term. I also say psilocybin, I say magic mushrooms, I say psilocybin mushrooms, but not medicine, entheogen, sacrament, or shroom.
Okay, good. So then which one should I use? So when did psilocybin become part of your life?
Ah,
So what was the point at which it first crossed your radar and you were like,
yeah,
okay, this is something that I'm
yeah.
interested in?
So I'm of an age where when people were doing psychedelics in high school, there really weren't magic mushrooms around.
Okay,
Where I was on the East Coast. On the West Coast, people were picking them for sure, but on the East Coast, we really didn't have them. What we had was LSD, and so that's what everybody took. So I didn't have magic mushroom experience as a young person, when people usually have their first experiences if they have them early, so high school.
but you did
Then
have psychedelics.
I did took LSD. Yeah,
Okay,
we
interesting.
we would try it. Yeah, it was fun. Then sometimes it wasn't fun. Yeah,
Do you have any
sometimes it was
stories
fun.
about that you be okay with sharing?
Uh, well, I had to trip sit somebody who had a classic bad trip.
Okay,
One time, she was, the spider bad trip.
I don't
They're
know.
like,
No, tell
oh
me.
yeah, it also exists with magic mushrooms, but where people see spiders everywhere, and it's just, it's like peripheral vision, but it's really terrifying.
Yeah, actually, I think I've
Yeah,
experienced that with another
yeah,
drug.
yeah. So she was freaking out, and we're both like 14, so Uh, but she got through it and it was okay. And other times, it was wonderful. I remember one time where I went to boarding school and it was in Vermont, and I tripped on, actually it was on mescaline, on peyote buttons,
Oh, cool.
which were very, not totally rare. Like they're not as rare as they are now, because I guess they weren't picked as much by, non-indigenous people. Um, but there was it was in the spring. The school that I went to was surrounded by apple orchards, and it was just that day when the pink and white blossoms were in full bloom, and the wind was blowing them around. So,
Amazing.
it was amazing if you were sober. And when you're tripping, it was like, oh my God, I'm in another world. So it was, so I have the good and I have the bad. Like most people experience, a spectrum of things. Then, later during the kind of club scene, the drugs that people were into, at least my crowd, there were different drugs. There was a different kind of scene going on, not psychedelics. And then I got into magic mushroom. Then I got into mushrooms in general. And when I would go to the different forays and festivals, you would never hear a talk on magic mushrooms. It was like psilocybin with a black sheep of the mushroom world. It was bizarre. They weren't, but I think it's because, as any kind of scientist, it would tank your career at that time to be doing work on it. And it's true that in 2006 a paper came out on psilocybin that came out of Johns Hopkins. That was the first paper in many, many years, like 30 years. Um, but it was still pretty much on the lowdown. It wasn't that, the crowd of people who were interested was still quite small. Um, except for the Telluride Mushroom Festival. That festival always was interested in psychedelic mushrooms, and that's where you could learn about them and hear lectures. And of course, now that's totally changed. There's like 300 different universities and colleges that have psychedelic departments. I mean, you can get a PhD in psychedelics now. So it was through the Telluride Mushroom Festival that I started to engage with psychedelic mushrooms and learn about them. It's where I started to try, consuming them. And from there on, I've just always been a part of this really small psychedelic mushroom community. It expanded when I made friends in the West Coast because they've always had access to a lot of mushrooms. Um, and it's just gone from there. I've been sort of carried along as the scene has become bigger and bigger.
So how long were you within that scene before you decided that you were going to start writing a book about having a good trip?
Um, so I wrote about psychedelic, about psilocybin in a book called Mycophilia that came out in 2011 or 2010, I think 2011.
Okay.
And that, so I wrote about it and I'd done some research and I'd done some trips and things like that. Um, and so I, just had it on my radar. And then when this paper came out, that was had a very a compelling visual that would show how the brain, it was like an MRI and a cartoon of an MRI that showed how the brain was differently connected and disconnected under psilocybin versus a sober brain. I saw that and I got very interested, as did a lot of other people. And I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about my own experience and about how important I thought it was to reschedule psilocybin and see where this could go, make it easier for people to do research. And the response to that, and that was in, I don't know, like 2014 maybe. And the response to that editorial was overwhelming for me. I had never had that kind of experience before. I mean, people were writing me letters and emails and tweets. And I mean, at one point, this woman tracked me down and she said, "You really need to talk with my husband." I said, "Look, I just have an opinion. I'm not a scientist, I'm not a therapist." And she said, "Just talk to him." And I did. We got together and he for coffee and he just cried the whole time. So, I felt this incredible need. I mean, I saw it, this incredible need of people had for alternatives to their psychiatric medicines that they were taking, Prozac or whatever their antidepressants were, SSRIs, things like that. And I thought, well, I want to write a book about this, about the new medicine. So I, and I said, I don't want, and I thought, I wrote a proposal or started a proposal to give to my editor and my agent. And then I was, kind of about halfway through the process when someone, I guess maybe my agent said, "You know what? Michael Pollan's interested in this subject and he's going to write a book about it." And I was like, well, yeah, I'm not going to go up against him. He's a best-selling author. So you know, I didn't do that. I didn't do what would probably have been a similar book.
Okay.
So I wrote about bacteria instead, which I love doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
but but that's how that happened. Then years later, Flatiron, an editor at Flatiron contacted me and said, "We want to do a book on magic mushrooms." And she said, "Do you have any ideas?" And I was like, "Well, I've been paying attention to this for a long time. And even though I don't want to do a book reporting on all the science, I want to do a book about, um, a more general resource on how this drug is being used today." Um, because since Michael Pollan's book came out and since Louis' movie came out, a lot of people started to get interested
Hmm.
and maybe use these drugs or try to find out about them. And, I was feeling like they don't have the information they need to make hopefully good choices for themselves. And that's the deal. So I ended up writing that book for Flatiron.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the whole story. Kind
uh,
of long,
well, no, it's
but there you
good.
go. Covers quite a few years, 15 years really.
so,
Yeah.
so it's interesting to hear that it's actually been a long journey
Oh
to
yeah.
get to this point.
Yeah.
So, there's so many elements that I want to ask you about. I guess the one that makes sense to maybe talk about first is there's a part in your book where you explain what's happening in the body when you take psilocybin. And I think that's a good one to kind of just set up at the beginning.
Yeah.
And then I would love to get more into about people's experiences and all the kind of other elements that you talk about. Um, so, yeah, what's going on?
All right. So when somebody eats a magic mushroom, and we can talk about dose and cultivars and species and this, separately.
Hmm.
The what happens is the mushroom encounters acids in your stomach and of course in your liver, and those acids shear off um, part of the psilocybin molecule. So psilocybin is the most plentiful by volume, it's the greatest, it's the largest a psychoactive molecule present in psilocybin mushrooms. Then there's others. There's an entourage, actually, psilocin and baeocystin and norbaeocystin and so on. There's a whole bunch of them, but they're trace. The main one is psilocybin. When that molecule, which is in the mushroom, which you eat, encounters acids in your gut, the acids shear off part of the molecule. They shear off a part of the molecule that's called the phosphate group. And and psilocybin without its phosphate group is another drug called psilocin. So psilocybin is considered a prodrug of psilocin. It is the drug that precedes psilocin. When you are tripping, you're not tripping on psilocybin, you're tripping on psilocin. And the reason why is psilocin is a little slippery sucker and is able to your pass through your liver, get into your bloodstream, travel around in your bloodstream, and pass the blood-brain barrier and dock into serotonin receptors on neural cells on your brain. The psilocin is actually, if you look at the sort of diagrams of the molecules, psilocin looks a lot like serotonin. So much
Ah,
so that your brain is like, okay, it's serotonin. It can dock into these receptors that stimulate a an electric like an electric impulse, which is how information travels from neural cell to neural cell in your brain to different regions, and that those impulses might tell regions of your brain um, to shut down or to open up. Um, and that causes the effects that we experience when we trip. Other physical things that happen is people typically will feel some nausea, and that may be because the psilocin, which looks like serotonin, is exciting serotonin receptors in the tummy, where you have a lot of them,
ah,
and that may cause the nausea that folks often complain of. Um, there's some good evolutionary hypotheses behind that because psilocybin or psilocin um, tears up the guts of slugs, which are a major uh, predator of mushrooms. So maybe the mushroom produces the psilocybin in order to dissuade slugs from eating him. Because anything with a serotonin receptor is going to feel or might feel the effects of being stimulated by psilocin.
interesting. That makes
Hmm.
a lot of sense.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. We're like slugs in that respect.
It's just kind
Others
of like
too.
a happy accident that came about. Yeah, that's so curious. So you mentioned before about different types of trip that people can take, be it, I guess, on the lower end scale, all the way up to, I guess they call it heroic doses. Is that kind of a term which you would
Oh, for
use?
doses, yeah. Well, yeah, people do use them. What do you
What's
want to know about them?
It's a good question. I guess maybe it's a case of laying those out as well. So
Ah, okay.
microdosing, and then so you actually mentioned in your book three approaches: microdosing,
Yeah,
therapeutic, and spiritual. Could you maybe talk about the
right.
differences of those?
Yeah, and there's some in between too. So
Okay.
all these are like, so the way I came to I don't make any dosing recommendations. I just describe what most people seem to describe as a specific dose,
Yes.
Um, right? So I'm not saying if you do this, that will happen. I'm just saying most people say this. It's kind of crowdsourced information. What happens on any given dose has a lot to do, is totally subjective, has a lot to do with the individual's metabolism, their mental state, the kind of setting they're in, if it's creepy or wonderful. So, setting aside all of that, in general, what my synthesis of the kind of popular uh, testimonies are is that a microdose is between 50 milligrams and maybe 250. Some people go as high as 500 milligrams or half a gram of of a um, of a ground up um, psilocybin mushroom.
Okay.
Now, the mushrooms vary in potency a great deal,
Okay. Yes.
right? So a microdose of one species, not only different species, most people are taking psilocybin cubensis because it's just the most common, it's the easiest to grow and so on. But there's all these different cultivars, like different breeds, right? And those different breeds of psilocybin cubensis have different potencies, and can cause different effects depending on entourages of trace psychoactives as well. So, there's all of these factors that I describe, when I go into the different chapters in detail, but that can alter the definition of what a dose is. But a microdose, half a gram or even 250 grams or less. So very small doses. 250 milligrams.
Milligrams.
Yeah,
Okay. I
yeah,
was
yeah.
just gonna check
Ah, oh,
that.
milligrams. So, yeah, so that's usually measured in a powdered form, and that's powdered mushroom, right? In a research in clinical trials, for example, they use synthetic psilocybin, which is not so readily available to the public or on the black market. Usually, it's just the whole mushroom that's been ground up. So then going up the scale, there's something that the wonderful herbalist Christopher Hobbs calls a museum dose, which is the idea of a museum dose is that it's enough for you can go to a museum. It's enough. Well, if you go to a museum, you might have a really good time, but you won't freak out, right? You'll be able to kind of hold your shit together. So the museum dose tends to be around 2 grams or less, 1 to 2 grams, or maybe half a gram to a gram and a half, right? But again, different people, different strokes.
Hmm.
Um, so then moving to a therapeutic dose, there, and so I'm throwing like a half a gram on either, a certain amount on either end, right? It's kind of a spectrum. A therapeutic dose is what you will typically encounter if you go on retreat, like in Jamaica, to a psychedelic retreat, or if you get into a clinical trial and you're taking synthetic. And that would be somewhere around 2 to 4 um, grams of a mid-range, mid-potency mushroom. The specifics, more specifically, 2.5 to 3 grams, or 25 milligrams to 30 milligrams synthetic. So that is very typical for a therapeutic dose. And what you achieve with therapeutic dose, supposedly, ideally, possibly, is an ability. You might have ego dissolution, insights, full trip, full spectrum trip. Um, you might have a lot of body load, not be able to move very much. Those are the trips where people have revelations about their personal lives and so on. Going up the scale, those heroic size trips are usually defined as 5 grams, 4, 5, 6 grams kind of spectrum. Um, you really don't want to be have to move for the duration of the trip. Those for some people can be very powerful trips, total ego dissolution, travel to other worlds, space-time travel. And then there's people who have advocated for even higher doses, but I've also heard on those really high doses it can be like having the flu. So there's not too many. I mean, there's plenty of people who do those kind of doses. I think there's a kind of macho thing involved. It's I did so much. I went into I don't know. That's people who do that. But those really big doses are less common than the mid-range museum, which is like those are the doses people might take to go to a rave,
It's more fun.
or a music festival where
Yeah.
you're not going to lose it, but you're going to be able to like dance and have a wonderful groovy time. And you could call it the Burning Man dose if you want,
Okay.
because you can still contribute and
Yeah.
participate,
Yeah.
right? But if on a bigger dose, you're going to be in your tent,
Yeah.
yeah, right? Out and traveling in your mind and remembering things from your childhood and all that, crying, that sort of stuff.
You
So
mentioned
that's like the more therapeutic side.
okay. You use the term ego dissolution. Could you
Hmm.
explain that a little bit to me? I don't know if I
Yeah, it's
completely
kind of,
understand.
yeah, I don't think anybody totally understands it, but what seems to happen on depending on, given the dose that can trigger it, is that the people's sense of self and their kind of thinking about themselves, um, their it's like their personality merges into dissolves and merges, and it merges into a greater reality. Like,
Okay.
typically in ego dissolution, it's like I'm no longer me, I'm part of nature in general kind of
Yes.
feelings. And that is often associated with mystical experiences, because folks that have that expansive feeling of being one with the universe will also see that as may see that as an indication that there's, God, that there's a greater good or intelligence or organizing factor of which I'm just a part, and that can be very satisfying. That can even be like part of their healing process. It can be really wonderful for some people. Ego dissolution can also be terrifying, especially if it like doesn't stop. And people after a trip feel derealization, like I'm in a dream. I don't know who I am. It's very tough. It's not that common, but
But it's a
it has to be
reality. Or
reported.
wow.
Yeah, if you don't know about it and it happens to you, how are you gonna, handle it, deal with it? Who are you gonna
Yes.
talk to?
That leads into some of the stuff that I wanted to talk to you about because you've given some good examples there. I wanted to kind of learn learn about the research process that you went through and kind of where you got the information from. And I'd love to
Yeah,
hear about people who had good experiences, people who had bad experiences, the things you kind of learned from those.
yeah. So the research I used was based on a few different types of data sets. So I
Okay.
I read clinical trials and talked with the scientists. It was interesting that, well, because those clinical trials are really focused on certain answers, like what happens if they, there wasn't that much opportunity to see a variety of experiences because the papers don't necessarily express that. However, there was one that is coming up on religious professionals who tripped. That paper is going to be due out soon, I
Oh,
think.
interesting.
Yeah, it was one of the last papers that Roland Griffiths was involved with before he died. He was a important and significant scientist in the psychedelic field at Johns Hopkins. So I spoke with a rabbi and a minister, and their experiences were very interesting and very, very different. The minister had a kind of experience of speaking in tongues and, all of this sort of word of God coming out of him, and it was fantastic for him. The rabbi, he had this existential nothingness, and he felt like he had like somehow he had failed the test to have a mystical experience. It was very disappointing for him. He was like, I spent 6 hours wondering why I'm so uptight about paying my parking tickets, and he was hoping to have something much more profound. So obviously there's a spectrum, but depending on the nature of the clinical trial, you won't necessarily learn about that spectrum. So then I used large surveys, which big survey data sets, which were good for understanding kind of trends, like what microdosing may do, what it may help people with, And then I had my own experiences, which I reported on, and then I used experiences from my wide network of people. I heard lots of trip stories, and then I read, and these are wormholes, I read social news sites, Reddit and Shroomery, and I just would fall down these trip report, they're called trip reports,
Yeah.
and I would read one after another. And, they were fascinating. So they would fall into these different kinds of categories. People would have revelations about themselves and how they interact with others that were that's that whole 6 years of therapy in 6 hours kind of,
Yeah. Okay.
thing. Um, Lots of bad trips, lots of bad trips. And it turns out there's maybe 30% of all trips turn out to be bad trips. Most people resolve them, but some don't. Um, and so lots of bad trip architects, people, archetypes, like people experiencing spiders and gooey vortexes that they are trying desperately the whole trip not to fall down into. Demons that say things like, yeah, you are a shitty person and you should kill yourself. Not good.
Whoa.
Not good.
Yeah,
It
that's wild.
happens. I mean, it doesn't happen a lot. And most people go, okay, that was the trip. Maybe there's something to learn from it. Um, One of the things that, in my mind, arose out of that kind of trip report is um, I really worry about when I hear phrases like, there's no such thing as a bad trip, there's only challenging trips. Have you heard this before? Or you won't get the trip you want, you get the trip you need. I mean, it's
I've heard
such
that before.
ghosting bullshit. I mean, that makes me crazy because if you've ever talked to someone who's had derealization, like that Alaska Airlines pilot last year tried to take down a plane because he was trying to wake up from a post-trip dream. He'd been in a state of derealization for 48 hours or something. It's a real, I don't believe in this rebranding of an experience which I see as possibly and in order to protect the forward momentum of the movement's legalization process. You know,
Yes. Yeah. There's an
that's like,
agenda.
and then people get hurt. That's fucked up. Anyway, I'm a little intense about that. Um, just because I think it's a mistake on the part of the psychedelic scene to not be transparent about bad trips. Um, then there is lots of, yeah, I did hear a lot of bad trips. It's funny how people, like when you put out a question to your social media and say, tell me about your trip. A lot of the time they're like, well,
There was this one time.
yeah, it was funny how much, the impact they have. But for the good trips, I heard all kinds of, wonderful things like there was this group of elementary school teachers who had decided on their weekend off they get together and just do a little mushroom thing together. And most of it was laughing and being silly and being relaxed and being kind of loving toward each other. But then the subject of this one child came up who was problematic, who was having a lot of troubles. And they found that their ability to think differently about how they might help this child was really enhanced by the psychedelic experience. And they actually employed some of the ideas they came up with and had great results with the kid as a result. So this sort of brainstorming or creative opening phenomena is something that a lot of folks reported to me. Most of it had to do with their own careers and personal experiences, obviously. Um, but they benefited, and were able to use it like almost like a tool
Yeah. Yeah.
to solve a problem. I know a number of people my age, senior citizens who have used it to figure out, well, not only to try to understand like how to be a senior citizen, how to because there's a lot of kind of side effects, mental side effects that come along with it, like depression and fear of death and grief because people start dying that and they'll use the mushroom as a kind of panacea to address the typical geriatric problems, as well as I'm at a fork in the road in my life.
Yeah.
you know, do I retire? Do I sit, whatever it is. Sometimes, taking the mushrooms can lend this great clarity. And that's what I've experienced because I don't think that it's like the mushrooms telling you what to do. I know people like to characterize it that way, but come on. I think what happens is
Yeah. Yeah.
you have a gut instinct. You know what the right way is, but for some reason you can't allow yourself to hear it.
It's true. I think,
And so
yeah,
that's what I think happens.
human intuition is like a probably evolving over so many thousands of years. There's this like
Yeah.
deep understanding of things that we can't really know, right? And I think tapping into that in some way is even in things like,
Just
and this is,
having
yeah,
access.
like tracking is a thing which people have been talking to me as I'm learning through these conversations in the podcast. Intuitive tracking is about actually feeling where you're being pulled towards rather than actually trying to technically observe the world around you, because
Yeah.
you know, like you said, you know where
Yeah.
what's going on. So
I
it's
think that's
interesting.
also why some people say that when they make they have those realizations in the course of a trip, they have this real surety. They're like, this is the truth. I know this is true. And that can be wonderful if you're having realizations about what choices you should make in your life. It's not wonderful if you have a realization that says, I am I am called to be a shaman and help other people or tell other people what to do or they need to follow me, because grandiosity is also can be emphasized as a result of a mushroom trip. So there's that.
There's some risks there in that sense.
Well, also risks if you go and hire a guide. Are you hiring a guide
Oh, right.
who's coming from that kind of place? You have to be careful. You have to know how to identify, look for the red flags. So I spent a lot of time on all that in the book. It's like consumer oriented, this
Yeah.
book.
Yeah. No, it's.
It really is.
You said you made me think of something as well that you mentioned in a talk when I was at a mushroom festival. You were talking about retreats and sometimes the issues with retreats claiming
Oh yeah.
benefits of their own treatments relating to other scientific
Correlative.
reports, like correlative.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah. I mean, this is a really important skill if you're using supplements of any sort, because it's supplement industry does the same thing.
Hmm.
So in what I spoke about that you heard was in let's just take an example. So there's a retreat that advertises its very expensive services. Retreats are typically $1,000 a day, and
Wow.
you might do 2 trips, so 4 days. You're there. It's not including airfare. You're
Yeah.
going to countries where it's legal to take the mushroom. Um, and then they're advertising because they're competing for clients. Uh, One retreat said, you can come to our retreat and cure your chronic Lyme. Well, that's curious. There's no science on that. There's 2 studies that are in, the process, but there's hardly any results out there. So where they came from with that claim, and this is very typical, is that they read one study that said chronic Lyme may be caused by neuroinflammation, a kind of inflammation of your neural cells. Okay. Then they read another paper done by another group of researchers from another institution that said psilocybin may relax or cure or help with with neural inflammation. Therefore,
Yeah. Okay.
right? That's how it go. That's how these things work. Therefore, psilocybin cures chronic Lyme, and the connection is neuroinflammation. And by the way, it's all done on mice, so there's that.
Yeah.
but but that they could be right. Sometimes claims, you know, sometimes correlative science, sometimes correlations lead the science, like
Yes.
in the case of the seniors that I was just mentioning. I mean, you have these geriatric diseases like depression, grief, fear of death, aches and pains, stuff like that. And then there's all these studies that are not on geriatric, they're not on old people, but on young people or whatever. They're not focused on the elderly, but show psilocybin's efficacy in depression and chronic pain and grief and fear of death and so on. Therefore, the mistake is saying senior citizens will benefit from from taking psilocybin for geriatric complaints. No, what you would say is, therefore, we should study geriatric,
Yeah.
senior citizens and psilocybin and see if they do indeed help with their geriatric complaints. That's the difference.
Right. It makes sense. But it's funny, like a murky ground where people can make these big claims.
Because it's money. People are
Always
trying to
right.
make some money.
It's always money.
And they're not necessarily wrong. It's just, it's like what you see in supplements, a lot of deceptive advertising. And people,
You
I was
mentioned,
just, yeah,
go
I'm
on, what were
sorry.
you going to say?
I was just going to say people who want to purchase these services are, I think, best off if they know how to analyze the claims, you know.
Yeah.
And it's not hard. I explain how to do it. It's what journalists do all the time.
Right. It's just coming in with better tools to understand the information that's being provided to you. You said
Totally.
something there about psilocybin being used to help people who are at an older stage in their life. But I actually listened to another podcast recently. I can't actually remember the name of it, but it was talking about exactly that subject, which I thought was really interesting. And it was perhaps even more of a step, an extreme step than that. It was actually how psilocybin can really help people who are terminally ill,
Yeah,
and how some research has been done, and you're probably more familiar with this research, I'm
I am.
guessing,
Yeah,
than me. But it was an interesting thing that like quite a large percentage of people who are at that stage at the end of their life
yeah,
are able to gain a new perspective.
totally. And it's some of the more promising of the research, or more, let me put it this way, it's some of the more persuasive, from my perspective, of the research. And that occurs in part because of this ego dissolution and feeling one, feeling like my destiny is the universal destiny. So an end of life like diagnosis, like terminal cancer diagnosis, can be very isolating. Why me? And it's really hurtful for people. And Louis covers this quite well, I think, in his film Fantastic Fungi. But when they have the trip and they can kind of open up to the notion that that their destiny is the universal destiny, they're not alone. This is the process of nature. Everybody has to die. It takes diminishes that isolation, diminishes the associated depression, and kind of lifts people's um, attitudes about their diagnosis. It's pretty persuasive, and it makes sense. But here's the problem. So people, psychopharmaceutical companies want to medicalize that and say, let's give this drug to people who are, at the end of their life and needing some. But it's very hard to get a regulatory agency that is built to test the efficacy of an antacid to um, to it's very hard to fit a clinical trial into that regulatory framework when how the drug works is to provide a mystical experience,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
It's like a whole
How do you
other.
rate that? Yeah.
I mean, the FDA has to like come up with new stuff. The pharmaceutical industry has to, it's like a whole new ball game. And it's really, people love to say, oh, the FDA suppresses like bullshit. They are not suppressing anything. It's just trying to put a round peg into a square hole. That's the problem. And, it takes a rethinking and a different kind of, um, it just takes, a different kind of process
Yeah.
that hasn't been invented yet. I'm
Right.
writing a Substack on that right now. I have a free Substack I do. And I'm working with this woman who used to be the clinical trials director for Compass Pathway, the biggest psilocybin pharmaceutical company. And she's like, wow, doing the designing clinical trials that work within the regulatory framework, big challenge. So we're breaking down the whole process so people can really see where the disconnects are. It's nobody's fault. It's just what we have versus what we want.
Yeah. It's just the wrong
Always a
tools.
problem.
I have to put a link to your Substack and your books and things at the bottom of the show notes when this goes
Okay.
live. So yeah, that sounds fascinating. I didn't know about the Substack. So
Yeah, yeah. Well, I really only have done it for a short period of time, and also when I'm doing like on book tour and stuff, I get distracted writing talks and things. So
Yeah, yeah.
anyway, I'm doing one on Amanita muscaria right now.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah. Dosing Amanita muscaria. Oh my God, what a shit show.
Okay, that's interesting because I actually just had a conversation with my friend about Amanita muscaria. He absolutely loves it as a drug. The
Mhm.
doses seem to be quite a bit lower than maybe I'm misremembering than psilocybin.
They're different. It's
Yeah,
different
yeah.
because you need to decarboxylate the ibotenic acid. It's just a different process, altogether.
It requires a
At
lot
the
more.
at the various mycologic, mycophagy events, mushroom eating events that I attend, you often will see people serving Amanita muscaria that's been rendered inert by decarboxylation, but rendered inert by boiling. It takes
Yes.
all of the psychoactives out, it leaves it in the water, and then you can eat the mushroom. And so they always put it on. They always like have a dish,
Yeah, yeah,
Amanita muscaria ceviche,
yeah, yeah,
Everybody
yeah.
gets all excited, but it's not that tasty. I mean, it's okay, I guess if you're hungry.
It's better than nothing.
Mhm.
Okay. You also said something else when we were talking before. We had a brief chat after your talk that you gave about some realities with taking psilocybin and the fact that a lot of people take them for these medicinal, I say medicinal benefits. I mean, I know that that's a hot term, which we talked about already, but people who are looking to improve their own mental state in terms of dealing with depression or anxiety. But that comes with some potential risks as well. And I thought that was interesting because it is now in the common kind of language used as as like an answer for that. Could you talk a little bit about your findings with that?
So it really seems to be used by people in two ways.
Okay.
The microdosers are using these sub-intoxicating doses. So they're not high, they're not seeing any visuals, they can drive, they can pick up the kids, they can exercise, they can work. But it's this tiny amount of serotonin stimulus to their receptors in their brain. I mean, that's what that's what SSRIs do is they increase serotonin and excitement. A microdose, theoretically,
Mm.
hypothetically, um, stimulates, gives you a low grade stimulate serotonin receptor stimulation. Not high enough for you to trip,
Mm.
but as high as you can get. The biggest microdosers take the highest dose they can take without any side effects at all. Um, and the idea is to stimulate their serotonin receptors. If you don't have depression, then maybe there's more to be, there's more effect for you. Um, People with varying types and levels of depression and anxiety have stated that the microdoses has been enough to increase their mood, to improve their mood.
It
Um,
has.
yes,
Okay.
plenty of people have said that, but there's no, but the only, and there's very little research out there. The only research, it's all anecdotal, which means that we don't know about all the other factors that could be involved. Are they taking other drugs or, you just don't know. Um, the only science that's been completed says that it's no more statistically no more effective than a placebo, which is not insignificant. Placebos are amazing, and look at homeopathy. That's just one big placebo concept at work. Um, but anyway, I've microdosed and found that and I don't suffer from depression, but I do have some low grade anxiety, especially when I'm on deadline. I'm like,
Yeah. Yeah.
like this. Am I getting everything? Do I sound like an idiot? That kind of stuff. And so it's helped me kind of maintain, retain a sort of levelness. And I do think there's serotonin excitement because I have felt time being expanded, which is a typical side effect. Like when you take psilocybin, 1 hour may seem like six, that kind of
Okay.
thing.
Yeah, which is
6 hours
handy
may
if
seem,
you're on deadline.
which is handy because there's just, there's so much, there's for me a lot of stimulation. It's like a work enhancement tool.
Yeah.
Um, Depending on what where you're at and what you're using it for, you're going to have different results. The larger therapeutic trips, who which people go to retreats for, or they sign up for clinical trials for, they're looking for the big revelatory. So it might be a perspective change. There's different ways of, and there's different metaphors that people use to describe it. I like, I'll give you an example of, uh, I'll give you an example of some really, I think, effective language to describe the potential efficacy of psilocybin. This is with addicted people who suffer from addictions. So there's a wonderful, I think he's wonderful, researcher named Peter Hendricks. He's at the University of Alabama. And he told me that the reason why he thinks psilocybin can help people quit whatever they're trying to quit, alcohol addiction or cocaine addiction or tobacco addiction, is is because psilocybin converts, and he's a therapist, so he's using the language of therapy. He says it converts shame into guilt. And I was like, what? And he said, here's what I think happens. If you are trying to diet, if you're on a diet and then you go to a party and you eat a cupcake,
Mm.
if you feel if you feel like I am a shitty person, I'm a bad person, I can't stay on this diet, that's shame. That's shame. I'm not good, so I can't succeed. He said what psilocybin does is it seems to flip that into guilt. So what happens is people on a diet might take the cupcake, but then what they say is to themselves is, I screwed up again, but I'm not going to screw up next time. That's the person who actually stays on the diet to the best of their ability.
Yes.
And that's the road to recovery. So that's like a potential of using the drug in therapeutic doses. Obviously, ideally with the help of somebody who is understanding what it is you're trying to achieve.
Yeah. It makes
It
absolute
can,
sense.
yeah. It
It's
can also take the brain offline, and sort of the way shock therapy works. The brain is offline, and then when it comes back online, it reboots into kind of normal pathways instead of the fight or flight type pathways that were triggered by a traumatic event. So that's maybe how it works with people who have PTSD, like veterans. They have a specific occurrence that, or people with grief, your husband drops dead and it's like a trauma to your brain. Your brain switches into these fight and flight modes, which then screws you up in all kinds of ways. You have PTSD. The mushroom experience seems to be able to, it actually does shut down certain regions of your brain temporarily. And then when they come back on, the neural pathways that those electrical signals we talked about earlier are traveling along are slightly changed.
yes. Interesting.
So that's another way it's thought to work. But who the hell knows? It's.
Okay. You mentioned about your own experiences microdosing. I'm curious to hear some more of your own experiences, maybe at higher levels of psilocybin. You also gave an example of someone who's experienced a bereavement and that kind of the trauma and how psilocybin might be able to help process that. If you're comfortable with it, would you mind sharing your story about you spoke about in the talk that I heard about your processing of the loss of your mother?
Okay. It's a little bit of a bummer, but let's go.
We can we can
Yeah.
pause for a second actually. So, I was a couple of stories that I wanted to ask you about, but obviously don't want to be a Debbie Downer, so
No.
um,
I'm happy to tell that story
it's
for
okay
sure.
because there's also I would really love to hear the story about your experience with the family and the get together that you told before as well.
Yeah, but I think actually the story about, going into my severely demented, paralyzed mother's body is probably more traumatic. So I'll tell that briefly, and then we can
Okay.
do the other one too, and kind of
Okay.
short.
Okay. As long as you don't mind, I don't want to
No, 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 I don't
bring up
mind at
stuff.
all. So this was a trip on 3 grams of Psilocybe cubensis, and the cultivar was Golden Teacher, so sort of like the vanilla mushroom. And during the course of the trip, at one point in the trip, I just kind of entered my mother's body, and so I've been caring for my mother for quite at that point for like 5 years. No, it had been more. It's 6 years. And so she couldn't roll over, so we had to turn her every 2 hours. It was really, and we kept her at home. And it was very worrisome to me. I was always like, how much does she understand? Is she like awake in there? Like anybody would
Yeah.
feel. It was a little freaky. So being in her body for a while on my trip, that might sound pretty horrible, but it really wasn't. It was like observational. And I think what was going on is that I had so much experience taking care of her that I was just able to apply that and really feel like what it was like to be in her shoes based on information I had from years of caring for her. So, what happened while I was in her body is that um, I couldn't feel my arms and legs. I felt like I was just a skull and a spinal cord, like those really creepy chiropractors models,
Right. Yeah.
models you see in
Yeah.
the chiropractor's office. But that's like my totality of myself. And it was, I wasn't scared. It's just that every once in a while I would like move my fingers around to make sure I was still me. And then once I was assured I was, I would allow myself to fall back into this lucid dream. But it was very like I was there kind of feeling. And at one point, I had to pee, which is for some people, you can say I'm not going to drink any water before my trip, so they don't have to pee in the middle of like the apex of it. Some people just have to pee when they trip. It happens, and I'm one of those people. So I felt the need to pee, and but I became worried that I couldn't get up because I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. Because I was sort of in two places at once, and myself and her. And then I realized, oh, I'm wearing a diaper. I'm being cared for. I don't need to worry about it. And I had this incredible sense of relief. Now, I didn't pee myself, but I had this revelation or realization that the care my mom was getting was actually giving her a great deal of comfort, that she wasn't, frustrated and freaked out in her own mind, um, but actually relieved that she didn't have to struggle with caring for herself. Now, was that projection? Sure. It certainly worked out well for me, but it gave me a huge amount of comfort that I felt for a long time. And then, as is can happen with a psychedelic trip, is that it'll continually emerge. There's sort of revelations about the lucid dream that you have in your trip. Um, but about a year later, I realized, or I thought, maybe I'd asked myself, why did I have that weird vision? Why did I spend all that time in my mother's body? And yeah, I wanted to be consoled about how what it was like for her. I was worried about her, and that was true. But I realized over time that I was also worried about myself
Mm.
because my mother's illnesses are hereditary. And so underneath all of this, was this kind of abiding fear. Is this going to be my destiny? So spending time in her body relieved some of the fears, not only the concerns I felt for her, but maybe these really deep-seated fears I had about myself. I mean, that's not small potatoes for, a 6-hour adventure. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, a relief. Not that, I'm still like, oh, I hope it doesn't happen to me. But, it just kind of took it out of the subterranean world and put some light on it, um, that can help, just going forward with life in general. Um, And I think it also kind of fed into my fear of death and my sort of freaking out about becoming a senior citizen. In the course of writing the book, I became a senior citizen. I'm 65. And I was like, you know, okay, is it my turn? Am I ready to become paralyzed? So all this was happening at the same time as I was doing these trips for research. And I wasn't trying to achieve anything. Um, but I did set intentions, which a lot of people do in order to try to direct their minds during a trip to to address certain things that are happening. So if you are like in clinical trials, if someone's doing a tobacco addiction study, they'll tell the participants, you want to have a mantra, like I'll stop smoking for myself and my family, that kind of thing. And you set up that intention, um, and it becomes a sort of touchstone during the course of the trip. Oh, this is why I'm doing it.
Interesting.
Yeah, a lot. Intention, some people think intention is crucially important. Um, but sometimes you don't need an intention to still get some cool experiences. I mean, that happened to me very early on. I had no intentions. I just wanted to be safe and have fun. And I ended up having some revelations about like, getting old and losing my looks. That was years ago. So, so such stuff like that. And then the other trip that you're referring to, that it was really not a single trip. It was more like the
Yes.
totality of trips and all of these sort of insights into myself and how I am with others. And, just like I would have little revelations throughout different trips. Like, oh, I tend to, blab about something because I'm trying to please somebody and I should shut the fuck up, that kind of, or I don't need to do that. If they're talking to me, they're probably okay being my friend, that. So it was,
Yes. Okay.
those little things that I just, because it happens during a trip, it can be very impactful. I'm like, I remember it. I remember the moment,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
though I was deep in outer space, I remember, I tend to do that. I got to stop. It's not good for them, for me, for anybody. But so it was the accumulation of all these little things, a lot of them about shit that I do that gets in my way, that I was able, it's almost like I chipped away at the stuff that at the walls I've put up, or the triggers that I have, the behaviors that made my experience with other people less profound. So I can tell the example if you want,
If you
if
don't
you're not
mind,
worn
I
out.
think,
Yeah,
yeah, no,
happy to.
I think that would be great. Yeah.
Okay. So, the example I use is in the epilogue of the book. So the book is, Have a Good Trip is not like Eugenia's journey. Although I tell my own stories as they apply and if they illuminate the narrative in some way, but by and large, it's like, here's a resource for you that's vetted by my journalistic standards. Um, but and the epilogue, I just go whole hog, as my mother would say. And so the example I give is this pig roast that we have every few years in Colorado. Um, so the pig roast is an occasion where we get a huge pig and we stuff it and then we wrap it with muslin and then we bury it in a pit overnight. And the pork is really tender and delicious. And we usually have a big community type party. Lots of people come. And then one year, the first year that my son, who's an adult, but he showed an interest, and he said, "Let me take it over. Let me do it for you," which sounded great to me. And he came out, he had a bunch of friends, and I just held on to every detail of that pig roast, just like anally. I was like telling them where to get the pig, and I told them what to stuff the pig with. I showed them how to wrap the, I mean, I was like all over them. It got to the point where they just didn't do anything on their own, and they would just, and these are adults, and they would come around and just ask for another round of instructions. And I was just getting more and more put out about it. Like,
Yeah.
this is so much work
Yeah.
for me, but I made it so much work for me, right?
Yeah.
Because I couldn't let it go for whatever reason. And that was true, across the board. Like, for example, my relatives from my husband's family from Santa Fe would always come up for the pig roast. And during those times I would cook these dinners that I always cook, and I'm fairly accomplished cook, and um, but I would serve them in the sort of Italian style that I grew up in, which is first course is pasta or a soup, and then the second course would be meat and vegetables and things like that, and then a salad, third course. So there'd be like different plates. And my relatives from Santa Fe were always like, ugh, having to wait for the next course. They just could never get with the program. It's like if I didn't bring them the plate of food they were supposed to eat and then the next plate of food they were supposed to eat, if there were platters or anything, they'd always put everything on the same plate. It would drive me freaking crazy. It's like I've done it the same way for decades. Like, get with the program, people. Um, but everything changed after that, year, 18 months of tripping. When Mo, my son, came again and said, listen, I want to try the pig roast again. Uh, I just gave him the name of the farmer and who raises the pigs and kind of forgot about it. He got the pig. Then when they came around, and said, what should we put in the pig? I was like, look around the place and see what there is. And it was kind of amazing. They filled it with apricots because there was an apricot tree and there was huge oregano branches in like a bushy area of the garden. And they put those two things in the pig, and I was like, wow, that's pretty inventive. Um, the When it came to wrapping the pig and all that stuff, I gave him the Muslim, and then I went antiquing with my sister-in-law. I just like didn't sweat it. Um, and the pig, because it's an overnight thing, I'd always been worried about fires on the mesa. But when I went out and I slept through the whole like burying the pig, I just didn't even think about it. And the next morning when I went out, usually all around the pit there'll be like beer cans and cigarette butts and stuff like that. There was none. It was like pristinely clean. A few buckets of you know, positions, water,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
case of things get spark. I mean, it was like amazing. Um, and I was like, wow, this is really working out so good. And then I went into the I went into the cabin, and there was, I saw somebody exit the toilet. So we don't have that many. This is a cabin, so there's not that many toilets. And I'd gotten a porta potty and put it up. The Mo and all his friends, there's about 26 of them, and they had built this tent city. So I provided some porta potties for them in their tent city, but they didn't really like it. They like to come in and use the proper bathroom.
Yeah.
Um, and they were doing a lot more flushing, maybe obviously than ideal, because when I walked into the bathroom, I saw the water over the
Oh
lip of the
no.
toilet because like this and dripping over the edge. So I contacted Mo, said, we got a problem. He got to work on that, but as they're plunging, the shower fills up with this like brown gunk, right?
Oh.
Really nasty. So then we cover with, tape. Don't use this bathroom. Don't use this shower. And then went into the kitchen and washed a coffee cup, and the shower filled up with gunk again. So that whole side of the house, the kitchen, the dishwasher, the washing machine, clothes washer, the bathroom, the shower, the toilet, the sink, all of it was off limits. We have this little cabin. There's one other little bathroom. And we have 50 people coming for the pig roast,
Wow.
in like 3 hours.
Yeah.
So I guarantee in the past, I would not have thought it was funny. I mean, I would have been like so uptight and so concerned and so pissed off and so agitated. Um, but um, but not this time. This time it just seemed utterly ridiculous. Um, the and it was even more ridiculous when so everybody that everyone came. We made do. It was fine. People use the outdoors. If you don't care about it, it's not a problem, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it was made all the more silly when the next day the guys that came to dig out the sewage was they were like one guy. There's two old cowboys. One of them had a cast on, and they had this business called cheerful cesspools. And I just lost it. I was just having so much fun. I was texting my son who had already split by that time, and you know, telling him, "Oh, it was a humongous humongous pile of human dowdy, and just coming up with all these different ways of saying big and poop. And that was the entertainment from, and I guarantee in the past that would have been a real problem. But here's what I think changed. Ultimately, what the year of tripping did is it allowed me um, to recognize what's important to me. And what was important was the next generation taking over the pig roast. And getting out of their way was key. But in order to do that, I had to stop worrying about how things were done. I mean, the same was true of cooking dinner for my family during that trip, that period. And since then, I just don't do the courses anymore. I put everything out. It's buffet style. You can put everything,
Whatever
everything
you
in the
want.
same plate if that's what you want. My relatives loved it. And, I realized that once I stopped worrying about like when you eat your salad, I was much more able to enjoy being with my family.
Yeah, yeah,
So all of these kind of conditions that determined that defeat for me defined the right way, what had to happen for things to work. Once I let that go, then things actually worked.
yeah,
So that's the sort of reprioritizing.
yeah.
It's like a small thing but a big thing that happened to me as a result of using the trip. So I think I'm generally like a less obnoxious person. um, I hope that's the case. My family thinks so because when my brother-in-law left, he said to Kevin, my husband, he goes, God, Gina is just so chill this time. And Kevin goes, it's the mushrooms.
So you've been like, I mean, it's necessary in order to write an accurate book, but you've been very impartial in your observation about everything. But your personal experience, that I mean, from the things you've told me, it's been meaningful and positive. I think it might be a personal question, but do you plan to continue taking mushrooms in some capacity in your future?
Yes, there is like this kind of reboot thing that people talk about, and I can see the need because it's been a while for me. And it's like it's really kind of a if you put it in therapeutic terms, and let's say you see a therapist for a while to solve like a crisis state, but then maybe every 6 months or every year, you might go back to kind of remind yourself of why of what's work of why things are working,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so I think that is what I could do. On the other hand, I could have a bad trip, and I've always avoided bad trips because I think, because I've been very careful about set and setting. Like I don't suffer from depression, which does increase your chances of having a negative experience, which is ironic because that's the reason why a lot of people take the drug. Um, but I don't trip when I have a flu. So there's things you can do to mitigate um, uh, to lessen the chances of stuff going south. I've always been in a safe place where I was felt like I was okay, um, and that I knew where I was going to be 6 hours late. That kind of stuff. Um, so I benefited from that and haven't had a bad trip, but I'm still worried I might.
yeah, yeah.
I'm not one of those cavalier people who say, I got this, because I know you don't got it. This is, what can burble up from
Yes,
inside is really an unknown
you can
quantity.
never know.
Yeah.
I have one last quick question if you have time. Is that okay if I just ask?
Yeah.
Maybe it's a big question. I don't know. Where do you think, or maybe hope, that psychedelics are headed in terms of society?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually, because right now I think my book is suffering from censorship. There was this huge national media enthusiasm about psychedelics,
Mm.
lots of headlines and all that. Then, uh, then Lycos happened, and some and more publicity about harms started to be reported on. And now I'm seeing a shift where, in my view, the our media ecosystem is like, you know, we're doing the opposite. We're not going to touch this except for, news stories like what's happening with the different companies or a report on a new clinical trial. And, for me, that sucks because I'm like kind of, this is consumer oriented. So it's like a sober look at tripping.
Yeah.
There's no advocacy. And yet I think I'm getting swept up in that. Listen, it occurred to me that maybe everybody thinks this book sucks. But, I don't think so because, listen, as a writer, yeah, but it's easy to go there. But my reviews elsewhere, in the like
Yeah. Yeah.
wholesale print have been great. And people, whenever I do talk, I sell like all the books. Um, I know the need is out there for these because people are still interested. They just, it's just hard to get information that's not loaded with advocacy or and uh, so
Yeah.
I'm feeling like right now we're at a point of contraction when it comes to psychedelics.
Hmm.
Um, my guess is that if Bobby Kennedy is confirmed as Secretary of Health, that I don't think he's going to be able to change, the FDA. He has said the FDA suppresses psychedelics. I don't think that's true personally, but that's what my research bears out. But he could very well come out with some public statements like psychedelics are a viable way for you to treat your depression. Then we're going to have more people seeking out this drug who don't necessarily have that much information about how to move forward. And now, like I can't put the title of my book, I can't put the cover of my book on my public Facebook page. It's taken down.
Yeah.
And I've had other social media censorship, which I get, but on the other hand, I'm like warning people, it's like a blanket censorship. Now with
Yeah. Yeah.
Meta's new their new decisions, they're going to take all of it away. So it's like, we're sort of swinging from one extreme to the other. And in the meantime, who loses perspective? Who loses information? Well, the general public. And so I think
Yeah.
that we're kind of fucked in a way. We're just not in a good place. And um, so where it's going to go, my guess is in an ideal world, we will find more people reaching out to indigenous communities and saying, how do you do it? And paying them for their advice. How do you incorporate this drug into a cultural, into a community, setting aside the fact that that community may be made up of people of different religions, because the indigenous folks who kind of brought this drug to our attention, the Mazatec people, their cosmology and their medicine are combined. And so it's a whole different approach to the use of the magic mushrooms. Um, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn from them on how we might go forward with this uh, in the future. And I'm thinking, communities, like community. I like this guy Colin Pugh's ideas, also Dennis McKenna, that there would be, could be kind of community centers that are staffed and cater to people in the community with these drugs. Um, that's not so dissimilar from the village model
Yeah.
that has worked for 1,000 years. Uh,
Yeah.
but we'll see. That a lot has to change, but
Yeah.
that might be another way to go about it.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Thank you, Eugenia. It was wonderful talking with you today.
It was super fun.
Thank you for sharing your time. I know we went quite long,
That's
but
all right.
that
You
was...
get an editor. You can cut it up.
So I will put a link to all of your books. Have a Nice Trip, Mycophilia, Well Preserved, and all the other ones. I'll put a link, or even maybe I can put a link to your website as well, so that people can go
Yeah,
there as
they're
as a
all,
resource.
yeah, everything's listed. All the books are available there. Not you can't buy from me, but like the benefit is that you don't have to buy Amazon. You can, if that's your thing, you can buy from Indie or any of the other
Yeah. Okay.
online retailers. And then Have a Good Trip is widely available in bookstores. So support
Great.
your local bookstore.
Yeah. Is there anywhere else that you'd like to send people if you think it's an interesting place to go, or is that we've got everything covered?
I have an Instagram account.
Okay.
where I, do a lot of food stuff. I just did a post about aromatizing, trying. I think there's some bullshit there, but what makes the Oregon truffles, where their aromatics come from, and how possible it is for them to be transferred to like an egg.
Okay.
Um,
Yes, I just saw that post actually.
so I do stuff like that. I just posted about an incredible artist who's doing work that I think will appeal to the psychedelic community. Yeah, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's always fun.
All right.
And it's also an easy way to get a hold of me if there's something I'm particularly doing that you like, and you want to know more about.
All
So
right.
that's
Well,
it.
I'll add that link to the show notes as well. Thank you again, and
My pleasure,
good luck
Robin.
with all ventures and continuing in this kind of murky future at the moment of
Yeah,
psychedelics.
I know.
Good
It's
luck.
really it's really murky, but as I said, you got to follow your curiosity.
Right, that's another one done and dusted. Thank you again to Eugenia Bone for putting her stamp on another great episode. You can find links to her Substack, Instagram, and her website down in the show notes. You'll also find all the links to her books in her website too. I also want to say a big thank you to everyone listening. I'm guessing if you made it this far into the episode, then you probably enjoyed it. It would be fantastic if you could show a bit of support by giving us a follow, leaving us a nice review, maybe sharing it with a friend if you have the time. We've got more great episodes coming up. Next, we have Canadian adventurer Adam Brennan, who has some fantastic stories. I mean, he knocked my socks off. After that, in a couple of weeks following, maybe in a month from now, we have another episode with William Arthur Sprague IV, who's going to give his take on Amanita muscaria and other elements of psychedelic mushrooms, and a bunch of other stuff too. Right, it's time for me to stop waffling. Thanks again for listening, everyone, and until next time.
Welcome to the Wild Dispatch!